Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. Thank you so much for finding us. Thank you for being with us for a second episode this week. This is our budget analysis episode. Also on the podcast, Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning. Afternoon. What is it?
It's the afternoon.
Where are we?
Yeah, no, we're out of routine. It's the afternoon. And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good day.
By the way, Andy, we had Maurice Golden on the pod the other day saying he wouldn't be able to stand as a Conservative come the next election, assuming he was staying on. He's not. That was written up in quite a lot of the papers. You used to be the Director of Comms for the Scottish Conservatives. They must have had a fun, action-packed day after one of their own said, "You're straying so far from what I know I couldn't stand for you."
Yes, I mean, I wonder if they've just become desensitised to that, to be honest with you. I mean, you know,
Cheeky.
it was a little bit calmer in my day, so that would have been a sort of big bad day, I suppose. In my day, I'm not sure anything's much of a surprise to them now, really, to be honest with you. So, they probably moved on to something else relatively quickly.
Yeah, at least he wasn't defecting, I suppose, as far as they're concerned. Yes, so today we're all about the budget and the analysis of it. Later in the pod, we'll be joined by Mairi Spowage from the Fraser of Allander Institute to get an understanding of what all of this means. Right, and of course, you can share your thoughts. If you've got a voice note that you can share with us, we would really appreciate that for next week's episode. If you're a business owner, an employer, an employee, a taxpayer, somebody who's got a stake in this thing, which is basically everyone, then feel free to WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 404 6507. Guys, before we get to Mairi, let's do kind of big picture response, reaction from you both. Andy, let's start with you. When you consider Rachel Reeves and the budget she delivered on Wednesday, what are you thinking?
It was a budget that was not dissimilar to what we said on our podcast on Wednesday. It is exactly what it turned out to be. It was a budget that was aimed at her MPs. It wasn't aimed at anybody else, really. It was there to pacify our MPs and to, in the short term at least, keep her and Keir Starmer solid in their jobs, which I think, in fairness, they now probably are until May, until the elections in May. I think that, budgets sometimes take a while to unravel, but I think that is probably the case. But, if you look at the detail of that budget, it was as old Labour a budget as you're actually going to find. It was only 18 months ago that a lot of people, I have to say, including me personally, voted Labour thinking that we were getting stability, economic competence, frankly thinking we were getting Blairism, let's just be honest, thinking we were getting a kind of new Labour type of agenda. Well, I mean, that is dead, right? That is absolutely dead. And in many ways, this budget it's just mythical, right? It's not real. It's not based on reality. It's a mythical budget.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
because of the timing of it, because a lot of the stuff that they've announced isn't going to be implemented for a year or two, or even towards the very end of the Parliament.
Well, yes, and that's part of what's mythical. And interestingly, I'll mention later on, I was at the Scottish Chamber of Commerce annual dinner last night. A lot of industry leaders in the sort of pre-chat saying, well, you know what, it doesn't really matter, because they're not going to be there anyway by then. So a lot of these things won't even happen because they're going to be gone. So I thought that was quite interesting. What I mean by mythical budget is it's a budget that pretends that the realities are not the realities.
Yeah.
It's a budget effectively grounded in fantasy, where you have a situation where spending by really any measure is so far out of control. We've now got, as the OBR said, the welfare bill is going to go from, I think I'm right in saying, about 330 billion to just over 400 billion in the next 5 years or so, driven effectively by the triple lock on pensions and by the increase in welfare for working age people. Nobody in private thinks that's sustainable. Nobody does. Everybody acknowledges that this cannot possibly go on. There's a really interesting, I quoted one Labour MP on Wednesday's podcast, but it was very interesting. Other Labour MP also speaking to the Times, who said, and I'm quoting him now, "It's a disaster. We're on the wrong side of every statistic and public opinion." And that is correct. I go back to these tracker polls and the polling that has been done, they all say the same thing. We don't want more spending increases and we don't want tax increases. We want the opposite. Well, Labour has delivered tax rises. Tax is now going to be the highest it has ever been by 2028, highest ever on record. And they've delivered spending increases. And that is not what people want. You can discuss, by the way, individual decisions. And obviously the most notable one is the two-child cap. Now, I've got my own views on the two-child cap, and they're a bit more nuanced than a kind of black and white issue. But polling is quite black and white, to be honest, on the two-child cap. It's popular. It's popular. People don't want to get rid of the two-child cap. So the big thing that they are trumpeting, it's so ironic, right, for a political party that's trying to be popular. The big thing they're trumpeting is something which every poll tells them people don't actually want. Especially voters. People who vote don't want it. So I just think it was a budget that wasn't grounded in reality. It's certainly not a budget to improve the economy. It is a budget to put tax up, to take money from people who work and to give it to people who don't. I mean, there's no other simpler way to put it. That's what it does.
Yeah, just on the two-child cap, because it's something that has obviously caught the attention of the Scottish Government and the SNP as well. So some of the numbers on it, it's estimated to cost around £3 billion a year by 2029-2030. The government estimates the measure will mean 450,000 fewer children are in poverty by 2029 to 2030 as well. You mentioned polling as well, Andy. So the public are more likely to support the cap than oppose it. YouGov earlier this month found 57% in favour of keeping the policy. Worth noting also that the Scottish Government had already announced plans to mitigate the cap. They were going to be offering payments to affected families from March. They will not now need to do that, presumably. John Swinney says it'll free up resources to spend on other measures when it comes to tackling child poverty. Lots more on the specifics to come with Mairi Spowage in a few minutes' time. Geoff, let's get a thought from you. Obviously, this budget was being watched closely in the North East for obvious reasons around oil and gas and the transition. What's your take? How's it gone down there?
Well, there's a lot of despair and anguish about Calum. I was with a bunch of supply chain companies this morning. I think one of the reasons they are so angry is because there was a briefing from the government, not 2 weeks ago, that suggested that the Treasury would indeed take away the windfall tax starting from next year. And they were very genuinely hopeful that they didn't have to make cutbacks as part of that. So I find that whole briefing, and I've talked about it before in the podcast, totally regrettable. But a number of points, if I may. The first point is this. This week, we've seen the publication of the North Sea Strategy as part of the budget process, and the UK government has now identified what it deems to merit a windfall, and that is somewhere between $95 and $97 a barrel for Brent crude. It's not been that in 3 years, and yet the UK government are asking the industry to pay this windfall tax right up until 2030 when they want to take it off. So by their own argument, there is no windfall. By their own metric, there is no windfall. So when we hear politicians saying they're making excess profits, no, they're not, because by your own measurement, they are not. And by the way, it's $63 a barrel right now, some $30 off that windfall threshold. Second point is this. I read in the Press and Journal today, Ed Miliband said it was just too expensive to get rid of the windfall tax just now. Well, I am reading the digest of UK energy statistics. That's the Duke's report, the UK government's own statistics, which tells us in 2024, last year, the UK imported fossil fuel products worth more than £60 billion. Now that is expensive. Moreover, the OBR says North Sea tax revenue will fall by 93% to just 300 million in 2030, and actually stipulates that the windfall tax is a contributing factor to that. Now, we know from the regulator, the NSTA, that there's 6.3 billion of undeveloped but discovered oil and gas in the North Sea. Why don't we just produce as much as we can to reduce our reliance on carbon heavy and costly imports? You get greater tax revenue and support a lot of workers. It is not too expensive, Mr. Miliband. The third point is this, and I don't think anyone can accuse me of not playing this issue with a straight bat. I have been hugely critical of the SNP and their presumption against oil and gas under Nicola Sturgeon. I still can't believe it that an SNP leader would throw one of its most profitable and economic valuable industries under the bus in such a fashion. I have been critical of the Tories for having 4 or 5 fiscal regimes in as many years for oil and gas, and they were the ones that introduced the windfall tax. But the problem for the Labour Party now, Calum, is that they've had a whole year to think about it. They've had a North Sea strategy, and they've now had their budget, and they've chosen inaction as opposed to action. So what befalls the industry now will be directly put at their door. They cannot turn around and say, oh, the Tories this, the SNP that. No. This is all on you. You're the government. The buck stops with you. And that links me to my next point. What is going to befall this industry? Well, I'm. It's very hard to say this, but there will be lots of job losses. Hundreds, if not thousands of job losses. In supply chain companies particularly, the very companies that we need to be the drivers of transition when renewables are available at scale. Now, unlike Anna Sarwar, I have advised a party, I've been in a party that won an election. Unlike Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband, I've been in a party that won re-election. And I can tell you this, you cannot win elections in a backdrop of mass unemployment and deindustrialisation of one of your most valuable industries. It seems to me that one observation, let's put it this way, that I have over and above what I've said, is that I learned from some former colleagues in the financial services industry, that the Treasury had written out to them to say, oh, listen, you've avoided some of this pain, there's no levy, will you support the budget? Give us a supportive quote, that happens a lot of budgets, I accept. But it got me thinking, if the oil and gas industry was on the banks of the River Thames as opposed to the banks of the River Dee, would we be having this conversation? I suspect not. And I also think it seems that this industry up here is not seen and not heard. Well, I think my fear for the Labour Party is if they do not take action immediately, then they will be not seen and not heard.
Andy, we'll talk more about energy with Mairi as well in a few minutes when we just kind of consider all of this. I'm trying to understand the thinking behind the budget. And I say that because new polling out today from YouGov is not particularly complimentary of what was announced on Wednesday either. In fact, it's pretty scathing when it comes to just how bad this has gone down. So 48% see the budget as unfair, 21% see it as fair. That's the second worst score for a budget recorded by YouGov. Only Liz Truss came worse than that. 50% say this budget will leave their family worse off. 3% say they'll be better off. A clear majority of people oppose the tax rise on workers and oppose lifting the 2-child benefit cap. It's a huge indictment of these big decisions that have been taken. And here's the other bit. 2/3 think things will get worse over the next year. That is what they have done to themselves this week.
They absolutely have. And extraordinarily, of course, the worst bit is the bit that will happen just before the next election, which is when the taxes go up.
Because it's all backloaded.
Completely bizarre politics.
Defies electoral
bizarre
logic,
economics, but actually also bizarre politics. Do you know, one thing that I think sits behind all of this, and it relates to what Geoff said, because what Geoff is talking about is actually about jobs. That's what this is, right? This is about jobs. It's about jobs for people in the Northeast, and we know they're already losing them. They're already losing them. You don't have to wait till 2030 to lose their jobs. You're losing them today. This is an extraordinary disconnection between the Labour Party and the working class. That's what is going on here. The Labour Party was formed 100 years ago specifically to represent the working class. The Labour Party has become extraordinarily disconnected with the working class. The Labour Party is a very, very middle-class party, a very public sector party. Polling shows as well, Labour Party voters are the highest educated voters in the country. It's a very middle-class vote, far more likely to be graduates, for instance, far less likely to be working class. And the government is again taking money out of the pockets of people who work. And I think if you get back to the very basics of that, of what the Labour Party is about, it's quite mystifying, I think, that's what they've allowed themselves to become. Because I do think that, and then they don't understand why people vote Reform. But I think Reform are trying to create a new working class in the country of workers who will vote for a party that thinks represent them. And I just don't think workers think the Labour represents them anymore.
Yeah, it's a really well made point, Andy. I mean, look, one thing that I've really struggled with at this budget process is that, we have heard time and time again the defining mission of our government will be economic growth.
Yeah.
That will be what it is. And yet, the OBR said in the very budget documents it was asked to analyse that none of the measures, pretty much within this budget, will engender economic growth. And I just find that circle's going to be so hard for them to square. Because how do you take a programme of ambition, inspiration, of aspiration to the country when you can't actually deliver? And it's not just, a government in its infancy. It's been in 18 months now. This is its second budget. And I thought it was really interesting listening to the exchanges between John Swinney and Anna Sarwar yesterday. Anna Sarwar played quite a lot in his discussions with industry, with business, and in the Parliament itself, talking about the need to get economic growth. He didn't mention it once in his exchanges yesterday when he was talking about the budget. And I think that's a real problem. And Andy mentions Rachel Reeves not getting a very good reception when she was mentioned at the Scottish Chambers dinner last night. This is going to be a real problem for you. And I suppose my final point linked to this is, it's only a day after, guys. I get it. But there hasn't been a post-budget bounce as far as the people are concerned. And I looked at the Sunderland by-election result. I don't know if you guys saw this. I mean, this is where they weigh the vote for the Labour Party. This is their traditional heartlands, going back to what Andy was saying about the links with the working class. Well, they've just been pushed into third place, and their vote is down 24%. I mean, the alarm bells must be ringing for this party.
How could they not be?
Well, exactly. Geoff has given listeners a preview, because actually I hadn't yet said anything about Rachel Reeves. However, Geoff knows this because it was on our WhatsApp. It was on our WhatsApp discussion this morning. But let me give more detail from our WhatsApp discussion this morning. So this is a reference again to the Scottish Chamber of Commerce annual dinner last night, where the MC mentioned Rachel Reeves's name. This is a room of 650 industry leaders, 649 plus me, and the MC mentioned Rachel Reeves' name, and there was a loud chorus of booing. Really? Incidentally, right in front of Anna Sarwar, who was sitting at the table right at the front of the hall, a loud chorus of booing for Rachel Reeves. Now, okay, a lot of budgets are not popular, and she's not the only Chancellor, I'm sure, who would have been booed in that scenario. But a loud chorus of booing, and John Swinney gave the keynote address at the end. I'm not saying there was whooping and hollering for him, because there wasn't, but the feeling in the room towards John Swinney felt to me like it was relatively optimistic, to be honest with you. And these are serious people who were in the room last night. It tells you something.
Yeah, straws in the wind, maybe.
Do you reckon?
Sorry, just on that, I think you can overestimate that. It's an immediate aftermath and all the rest of it, and the business community, has a tradition at these things with a few drinks in them, I'm sure, of letting fly. But nonetheless, that would worry Anna Sarwar. I didn't realise he was in the audience. He'll be going, "Oh dear, we've got work to do here." There is a opportunity. This budget, a missed opportunity.
So what was the opportunity? Because the flip side of this thing is that the markets have responded fairly well. They've been pretty calm. In fact, there was a kind of a drop in the kind of cost of government borrowing in the immediate aftermath. So in terms of that particular constituency, if you like, the Chancellor has landed it. This budget has been considered pretty solid from the likes of the markets, the kind of notorious markets that ended Liz Truss's time as Prime Minister. Labour MPs are perhaps a bit more on side. The public are a bit fatigued by the whole thing. Is there another side to this budget, which is actually it's okay, it's going to get them through, and that's maybe enough for now?
I think it's going to get them. Well, it's going to mean they don't have to resign at the moment, which, to be fair, was something that was
it's pure self-interest
a couple of weeks ago. And I think that from the market's perspective, the markets were relatively calm, in part because everything had been so massively trailed in advance anyway.
Yeah.
but also because the key concern that the Treasury had was the cost of borrowing, which is so high, massively high, third highest amongst advanced economies in terms of the actual cost of borrowing. And because this budget didn't massively increase government debt, it increases a little bit over the first few years until the tax cuts kick in. So debt borrowing is going to pay for the increased welfare payments for a few years before tax then starts paying for the increased welfare payments. But I think I'm right in saying the actual debt to GDP ratio is falling slightly over the piece. So that will calm the markets to a degree. And of course, that was part of the game. But as I said before, let's just be honest about this. Budgets are about politics more than they're about economics. And the game for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer here was to do what your backbenchers tell you to do so that you can get a few months of a reprieve until the next thing goes wrong, or a few hours of a reprieve, as it turned out this morning, because of
indeed.
the issue
The workers'
with the 6 months firing clause. So I mean, there's always something, right? And this is the problem, okay? Because when you get backbenchers who are ready to rebel, they will find the thing that they then want to rebel on, and even when you give them 99% of what they want, they're going to start talking about the 1%, as they've done today.
And surely nobody disagrees with lifting 500,000 kids out of poverty.
Well, so it's dead easy to say.
Yes,
of course, I mean, this is the point
I'm being
with all.
provocative.
Welfare benefits are really, really easy to give out, but they're really hard to take back, and that is what the Labour Party has obviously found over the last 12 months.
Let's welcome into the conversation then Mairi Spowage, Director at the Fraser of Allander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. Mairi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Real pleasure. Thank you for being here to help us understand what on earth this week means, basically. Right, there's a lot of talk, and in fact, we've had a bit of it on this pod already, that this is a classic Labour budget. High tax, high spend. How far do you agree with that analysis?
I think that's a pretty fair analysis, to be honest. Some of the increases in taxation that were set out on Wednesday were used to increase the fiscal buffer that Reeves has. So, I mean, she basically, for the sake of the markets, treating the budget more kindly, and they seemed to take it without much reaction, although everything in the budget had been pre-briefed, so perhaps that's not very surprising. So some of it was used to increase that kind of fiscal buffer, but overall the big messages from it were taxes up and a significant package of extra spending on social security, given there was the removal of the 2-child limit. There's also other things about moving some energy bill levies to general taxation, trying to keep prices of rail fares and things like that down, which are sort of targeted at essentially trying to reduce inflation directly, which will help her in the medium term, presumably with interest rate decisions. But yeah, the headlines were definitely tax up and the 2-child limit removal, which is, there for tax and spend.
Yeah. And just explain to us immediately as well the implications of the kind of those headline decisions for Scotland, because the Scottish government's now got, 6 weeks or so before it will deliver its budget as well, now that it knows what the UK government's up to.
Yeah, and I think from the Scottish government's perspective, nothing has really changed very much. They don't have what they might have had, which was a huge, massive headache of what if Rachel Reeves had to actually put up income tax rates next year in the rest of the UK. That would have meant they would have had to respond, which we can get into why that's the reason they would need to respond to that, but they would have needed to respond to that potentially. So they don't have to deal with that now. The income tax threshold freezes that Reeves announced are coming in a few years' time for the next few years after that. So none of it's relevant to next year. And the Scottish Government only ever set their income tax policy, for the next year in December, or in this case, January. There's a little bit more money through the Barnett formula because of various decisions that have been taken at the UK level, but not a huge amount, a sort of few £100 million. And also the removal of the 2-child limit saves them a bit of money because the Scottish Government were going to mitigate that next year, and now they don't have to do that. So around the margins, there's maybe a little bit more room for manoeuvre for Shona Robertson, but things were pretty tight anyway. So I don't really think that it changes anything too much, but it could have done, and it really, really, really hasn't. So,
just
sort of as you were.
Yeah, just on that, Mairi, then our Holyrood Sources listeners are clearly the most intelligent podcast listeners of any.
Here.
So they not only do they understand the fiscal framework deeply, but they think about it most mornings, I think, as well. But just on that, then,
as one of your listeners, I know that that's absolutely true. And
well, exactly.
Complimenting yourself, Mairi. It's all about you.
I love it. So, but just to clarify, then, this is not really a budget where some of those slightly odd unintended consequences of the fiscal framework come into play. It's a much more straightforward sort of Barnett budget, as it were, where whatever the Scottish Government does is pretty much choice-based rather than out of any necessity because of the fiscal framework.
Pretty much, except for one sort of really detailed technicality, an interesting announcement, which was at the UK level, they're looking to tax property income at a different rate from other types of income. And property income is included in the income that's in the purview of the Scottish Government. So because the UK Government, for this slice of income, are looking to pass legislation to make it different, kind of like savings and dividend income is treated differently, and then tax it at a higher rate than normal income. There is an interesting quirk where they're saying they're going to have to, talk to the double governments about how that's going to work and whether the Scottish Government would want to follow suit and do something similar. So that's sort of tens of millions, though, sure, not to be sniffed at, but it's not going to be a huge impact. So there's that little wrinkle of how exactly that particular thing is going to work. But generally, overall, in the scheme of things, yes, there's not a lot of sort of weird consequences because of the fiscal framework that there might have been if they whacked up the rates of income tax, for example.
Can I jump in to do some politics just on what we were talking about there about the Barnett consequentials? So when Rachel Reeves announced this in the Chamber of the House of Commons, she said £820 million extra for the Scottish Government. And then she made fun of the SNP for not responding to that. And I was there, and they were sitting relatively quietly, I would argue, at that point. Then she sort of repeated it and said, because Anas Sarwar asked us to. I tweeted this week, and I've had a very, very fun week in my mentions ever since. Geoff, do you want to take on the politics of that? She's clearly trying to tee up Sarwar as getting something of a victory, but everyone's turned round and gone, well, hang on, if he could have got 800 million quid, why didn't he get more?
Well, I'm sorry. I listened to it at the time and thought, oof, that's the last thing I want if I'm Anna Sarwar, frankly, because now, it's like, okay, Anna Sarwar, you're clearly that influential, so why don't you tell the Chancellor take off the windfall tax, as I've just discussed? Why don't you tell the Chancellor to increase spending on X, Y, and Z? I didn't like it, I have to say. I thought I would have been squirming if I was Anna Sarwar in that situation. Don't like the politics.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, and you can see when the Chancellor was asked about this the next day, the massive trap they'd fallen into, because, she was getting a roasting about why she hadn't listened to Anna Sarwar about the energy profits levy or the impact it's having on the investment environment in the North East. So yeah, I mean, it's not because Anna Sarwar asked her to.
Well, yeah,
it's because they made particular choices about spending in England, which has generated mechanically Barnett consequentials.
Exactly. And this is the thing. I mean, and this is like we had this conversation on this podcast a year ago. They never learn, because all that's going to happen is in January, John Swinney's going to spend this money and he's going to get the credit for it. Nobody at that point is going to say, oh, that's that money that Anna Sarwar made Rachel Reeves give. I mean, that's not what happens. And look, we've been watching this for 25 years. It's happened to Tories a lot, where a Tory Chancellor would stand up at Westminster and say, oh, Ruth Davidson or Douglas Ross or whoever asked me to do this and therefore I've done it. And you look and you go, that's not true, is it? You've just, that's not true.
And they might find... They might find, Andy, that this is, and I'm sorry to jump in, but it's kind of happening as we speak, that the kind of honesty around the budget might actually become the story of the budget, because the OBR has put out more information about when it told Rachel Reeves that the downgrade in productivity forecast was going to be offset by increases in real wages and inflation. They told her that on September the 17th. By October the 31st, there was, in fact, no deficit at all. It had turned into a net positive of £4.2 billion, and that forecast didn't change from that point. So, from what the OBR is saying, it looks like Rachel Reeves and the Treasury were briefing ahead of the budget that there was a £20 billion black hole in the public finances that did not actually exist. And I just wonder if this is going to become a bit of an unravelling theme over the weekend. That
Mairi,
the public...
Mairi, sorry to interrupt. Thank you. I'm learning of it. Is that's a problem?
Yes, I agree it's a problem. And we pointed out at the time, as soon as they said this, that the reason that they were able to U-turn on the thing that they hadn't said yet, which would have broken the manifesto commitment, but had been briefed heavily and was the reason for this Downing Street press conference at 8 o'clock and all of this, was because they'd received a forecast and it was better than expected. You know, we said in a blog, this is not true. We know what the forecast process is. We know that there wouldn't have been a new forecast. And we can all see with our eyes that the reason that they've decided that they can't make this political choice is because of the political chaos that there's been all this week, that their backbenchers wouldn't wear it. And therefore, they decided not to take the leap and break the manifesto commitment. So this whole process has been a problem. The endless briefing of every single detail of this budget was briefed out and confirmed by Treasury sources in advance. That has never happened before. And it has all been done, not just the policy decisions, but also the different rounds of forecasts from the OBR, what the OBR were saying about this and that, with the OBR having no right to reply at all. And it's not the way the process should work. The process is normally done behind closed doors so that the market moving implications of the different policies come out when they're supposed to come out in an orderly manner in the budget. And there's not all of these market movements as a result of the Treasury briefing that's happening all along. I think that this is about the wrong lesson being learnt from the Liz Truss budget. You know, instead of it being, let's not announce unfunded tax cuts because markets don't like it, particularly in an era where we're very close to the edge of fiscal sustainability. The lesson seems to have been learned that it was because it was unexpected. And therefore, in order to ensure that the markets don't go bananas again, it's not about the policies, it's just that we need to endlessly brief everything out in advance so there's no surprises. And this budget process has caused unbelievable uncertainty for months. It's meant businesses aren't investing. It means consumers are nervous. Probably people have done things that they probably shouldn't have done. And that happened in the last budget as well. People were disposing of assets all over the shop that they probably shouldn't have done. Yeah. You know, so this is not healthy. This is not good. And it is not the way that the budget process should operate.
Yeah. Mairi, we talk, as you know, on this podcast quite a lot about energy. Indeed, Geoff's been talking about it already today. I know that the Fraser of Allander Institute has put out a sort of paper considering whether the energy sector in Scotland is at something of a turning point. I just wonder if you'd speak to that a little bit. What is it at a turning point in your view?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Geoff speaks to people in the energy industry much more than I do, of course. But and I am not, you know, an energy industry person at all. But we engage with businesses right across the economy, and no matter which part of the energy sector someone's in, you know, whether they're mostly tilted towards renewables and new technologies, or they're more in the traditional oil and gas sectors, many businesses, particularly supply chain companies, are doing both or all of these different things. The consistent environment is that the investment, consistent message is that the investment environment is awful right now. Yeah. And people are looking abroad, maybe going abroad. You know, supply chain companies are reorientating their work to other jurisdictions where the investment environment's more favourable because it's more profitable. That when they are doing renewables work at the moment, they're not making any money on it. And oil and gas bits of their work is all that's keeping them going, and that's starting to decline. You know, so what we wanted to do in this paper was to sort of illustrate the difference that could happen in the wider economy over the next few years if there are sort of different pathways for investment in oil and gas, which has significant impacts on the supply chain in Scotland, and the UK actually as a whole. And you know, So there's a real opportunity here that can be grabbed in terms of the energy transition. But at the moment, we're failing to grasp it. And it's not going to happen without work. It's not going to just happen. And what we might end up in a few years' time, maybe much of our energy system will have transitioned, but we won't have any of the economic benefits here in Scotland if we're not careful. And that's what's happening. Politicians are assuming it's going to happen. They talk about all of these jobs opportunities with this or that or the next thing. I don't want to hear about jobs opportunities announcements. I want to hear, where's the investment happening? Where are you improving the investment environment so the investment's happening? Because without that, none of these jobs are going to be here. None of these folk are going to be here. And we're going to lose a huge amount of economic growth as a result.
Listen, I've got very little to add to that, except I would commend to our listeners to look at this research. It's very well structured, thought out, and assessed. And actually, it confirms, you're right, the conversations I'm having on a daily basis, be it with renewable companies, be it with oil and gas companies, be it with supply chain companies. And politicians really, really need to understand the issues at stake here, because that point on investment is massively important, and we are losing out just now. That is my fear for this transition.
I find these sorts of issues fascinating because there is unanimity everywhere, apart from among politicians, it would seem.
Do you know what? So here's, Geoff, a question for you. I think I might know the answer to this question. However, I will set you up with it anyway. If you're advising John Swinney, given what's just happened in the budget, given the decision not to do anything with the EPL, if you're advising John Swinney, is this not the absolutely perfect time for John Swinney to stand up and say, we know that we may have been equivocal in the past, but let me say we are 100% behind the oil and gas industry as the key driver for the energy transition. No ifs, no buts. I mean, that's a no-brainer now, is it not?
You are right, Andrew. 100%.
I thought you were going to say no. So there you go.
So but the follow-up, surely.
But seriously, though, actually,
where's the reluctance?
I mean, surely that must be on the cards, though,
because,
right?
I don't know where the reluctance comes from. Clearly, John Swinney has made moves recently to intervene on EPL. He wrote an opinion piece in the P&J a day before, welcome as it was. Far too late, in my opinion. He should have been campaigning in the terms that Andy suggested for at least 6 months. And perhaps that might have accrued a better result. Look, politicians need to fundamentally understand the appetite out there for transition exists. But if they don't have the financial capital and they don't have the projects at scale to transition to, you've got a big problem. A big problem. And that's fundamentally what's happening.
From an economic and fiscal point of view, the fact there wasn't any movement on the EPL, and it's not necessarily about the rate or ending it, it's about the investment allowances. I mean, it was the removal of the investment allowances that really killed it,
Correct.
to be honest. And pretending that it'll come to an end early if certain conditions are met, which we all know are impossible to meet for gas prices, it's in place till 2030 now.
Mairi, can I just make this with you, because you've just said a really interesting point. If listeners want to review back to when we interviewed Anna Sarwar at the Johnny Walker experience, I think that was the start of the year, he conceded that he thinks we got it wrong on allowances. I had assumed that part of the budget would have been reintroducing of those allowances, Mairi, but it didn't come. So therefore, we have no choice but to focus on the EPL, the blunt instrument, because and so I do wonder if the UK government will look at that again, because something has to happen, guys. Because I'm telling you, we're on the precipice.
But there would have been no fiscal cost to it, really. I mean, the hilarious thing is, this is a windfall tax on excess profits which don't exist anymore, and you can see that because it doesn't bring in any money, and it's basically bringing in no money. So there would have been very little cost, and that's what I don't really understand. Is why, I don't know, some form of rhetoric is trumping fiscal and economic realities here. I just do not understand why, at the very least, they didn't think about, we'll introduce investment allowances to ensure investment happens. I think that's a very easy sell for everybody, and I just don't understand why they didn't do it, because it would have been at very little cost fiscally.
Yeah.
Well, another voice to add to the consensus, I think it's fair to say. Mairi, thank you so much. Thank you for making the time in a busy week to speak to us. We really appreciate you coming on the pod.
No worries. I'll see you again soon, no doubt.
Thanks, Mairi.
Thanks, Mairi.
Cheers.
Thanks, Mary. Geoff, you were mentioning that conversation with Anas Sarwar that we had on this podcast, which actually is not the first time it's been mentioned this week in the post-budget analysis. I want to let you hear this from the Radio Scotland Breakfast programme with Martin Geisler and Laura Maciver. They were speaking to the Chancellor on Thursday morning, and here's what happened.
You're sacrificing jobs to create that extra revenue. And that's a calculation you've made, is it?
Because the Energy and Profits Levy is bringing in £2.4 billion this year, and that money goes directly to funding our public services, including schools and hospitals. We made an additional £820 million available yesterday to the Scottish Government to focus on the priorities of the Scottish people. But money always has to come from somewhere, and it is right that we ask the energy companies to make a fair contribution to fund public services in Scotland.
The calculation is that if the energy companies pull out, that money will no longer be available because you won't get it in tax revenue. Let me ask you a very straight question, and give me a straight answer if you would, please. Did you consult Anas Sarwar over this plan?
I speak to Anas Sarwar regularly, and I talk to Douglas Alexander regularly.
So what did Anas Sarwar tell you? What did Anas Sarwar tell you about the windfall tax? Because here's what he said to a podcast here, the Holyrood Sources podcast in June. We have to make the North Sea an investable proposition. We'll get more tax for the Treasury and won't have to import oil and gas to the extent we've seen. To protect jobs and to give a fairer period around the transition to get the investment we need to attract into our country. He was in favour of a change to the windfall tax. Did you ignore him?
Anas Sarwar asked for money to lift children out of poverty in Scotland, and we delivered that yesterday. Around 100,000 children in Scotland won't be waking up hungry, won't be going to bed in a cold house because of the action we were able to take yesterday in cancelling in full that two-child limit brought in by the previous Conservative government. But the money for these policies, everything has to be paid for, and the Energy Profits Levy continues to bring in substantial revenues based on the high profits that these companies still continue to earn after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And I do believe it is right to ask those companies to continue paying a little bit more, the same tax rate that Norway applies of 78% to profits, and use that money to fund public services in Scotland. Yesterday I was able to announce £820 million extra money for the Scottish Government over the next 3 years. They can spend that money in the way that they choose on the priorities of the Scottish people, but taking money off energy bills and lifting children out of poverty were two of my priorities in the budget yesterday. And of course we have to raise revenue in a fair and sustainable way.
That's the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, speaking to Martin Geisler on BBC Radio Scotland. Andy Maciver.
Guys, let's just look. Just let's be honest here, right? It's Friday afternoon. I've been around unionist parties for the best part of a quarter of a century. The Westminster arm of these parties don't care what their Scottish leaders say. They don't care. Not interested. Okay, it's not a factor for them in their decision-making process. Rachel Reeves probably didn't even know that Anas Sarwar had asked for the EPL to be scrapped. I'm sure she's heard of our podcast, but she probably didn't know that he'd asked that to be done, and she wouldn't care because it's not part of her decision-making matrix. And I'm not criticising her. It's also not been part of any other Chancellor or Prime Minister's decision-making matrix for as long as I have been observing this stuff. The fortunes of the parties in the Scottish Parliament are simply not important enough to the parties at Westminster. They will throw you under the bus and then they will reverse over you repeatedly. That is what happens when you are the Scottish arm of a unionist party. It always has and it always will.
Where can we read more of your thoughts on this, Andy?
Well, actually, I wrote about this in the Herald today in my regular Friday column, which Geoff reads every Friday morning in the Herald, on the app, online, and of course in the newspaper.
Lovely. I think we will leave it there for our budget analysis. Of course, we'll be regrouping over the next couple of weeks, so if more emerges, we will get stuck in. And of course, we've got the Scottish Government's budget coming in the new year as well. So that's something to look out for. Andy and Geoff, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you to Mairi Spowage as well. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you have subscribed to the podcast, whether you're watching on YouTube or whether you're listening on your podcast app. Next week, we are in Edinburgh. We're taking part in our very first pub quiz. Will it be the last one? I don't think so. I think this is the beginning of something beautiful. So we'll be recording at that. In fact, we'll be recording our Christmas special at that, which if you're there, you'll hear. And if you're not there, you'll hear it later in December. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now because I'm struggling with lack of sleep and making any sense whatsoever. So thank you very much for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.